Bonsoir, good evening, oui. Mon nom est Émilie Retailleau, je suis conservatrice publique ici au CCA, so my name is Émilie Retailleau. I'm curator of public here at CCA, so I'm glad you are all here today or tonight to listen to this lecture by Cymene Howe about the life and death of ice. Donc, je suis vraiment très heureuse de vous accueillir ce soir pour cette conférence donc de Cymene Howe sur la vie et la mort de la glace. Avant de vous introduire Cymene, je voudrais commencer cet événement en reconnaissant que les peuples autochtones Ganyengehaga, de Ganawage, Ganasadage et Aguasasne ont des connexions de longue date avec Tiohtià:ke, Mouniang, Montréal. Leurs ancêtres, tout comme ceux des communautés Wendat, Anishinaabe et Abenaki, vivaient sur ces terres bien avant l'arrivée des colons. Aujourd'hui encore, l'île abrite de nombreuses personnes issues des Premières Nations inuits et peuples métis. Ces communautés continuent de subir la remise en cause de leurs droits et l'érosion de leur territoire traditionnel provoquée par les mécanismes du colonialisme d'implantation, système qui persiste encore de nos jours. Le CCA étant établi sur des territoires qui n'ont jamais été cédés par leur population autochtone, nous reconnaissons donc les racines coloniales de notre institution et nous nous engageons à favoriser des relations inclusives et positives avec les nations autochtones de Tiohtià:ke, Mouniang, Montréal et d'ailleurs. Je vous invite à aller visiter aussi la maison Shaughnessy. Il y a 2 semaines, on a ouvert une installation par l'artiste autochtone Amanda Leakers. Si vous êtes intéressé aussi à en savoir plus, consultez aussi notre site internet sur toutes les initiatives qui sont menées aussi par le CCA. So tonight, I'm very glad to welcome Cymene Howe. She is a professor of anthropology and co-founder of the Science and Technology Studies program at Rice University. This lecture is happening in the context of our exhibition, Oscillating Spaces. The exhibition is currently presented in the Octagonal Gallery, so it's the gallery right in front of the theater when you will exit the theater. So I invite you to go see it if you haven't done it yet. It will be open until February next year. And we have invited Cymene tonight to talk about her research as a climate anthropologist and of her creative works as well. Cymene will share some of her collaborative initiatives to memorialize glaciers in Iceland and around the world through acts of ritual and gathering. She will also explain how a glacier helps us reflect on life and death in the Anthropocene, and how they mark time and history through people, ecosystems, and geo-human relations. So please join me to welcome Cymene Howe.
Thank you, Émilie. I don't speak French, but I do recognize that you did a very important land recognition in French, so thank you for doing that. I also want to say thank you to Émilie for the beautiful introduction, and to Casey and Philippe and Phil and Francesco and Rafiko and Laura for all the hospitality that you've given me so far, and everyone here at CCA for the visit thus far. Behind me here today on the screen, you have an image of Rhone Glacier and the Furka Pass sometime in the 1890s. And here we see Rhone as a very lively central part of the landscape, framing the village and feeding the river. And from there, I want to take you here to Solheimejokot, a glacier in southern Iceland, and to spend a moment with these small drops of water erupting from the glacier's edge. This is admittedly a tiny bit of water in one small country near the end of the world. But it is also, of course, indicative of a much larger process of environmental transformation that is unfolding all around us. And that is the melting of glaciers everywhere on Earth. Today, I've arranged this talk into 3 moves, and that is the memorialization of glaciers, drawing attention to glacier loss in a global sense, and finally, a story that I'd like to share with you. And overall, what I'm hoping to convey to you this evening is how practices of attention, such as rituals and public installations and storytelling, help us to magnify the importance of glaciers, not only in our shared global environment, but also in our shared social and cultural worlds. And by bringing glaciers to human scale, I think, showing their connections to all of our lives, we can actually advance efforts toward their preservation. But I think it's fair to begin with this question, and that is, what are glaciers exactly? Well, first off, glaciers are bodies of ice. To be a glacier, that body of ice needs to move, and it needs to flow. It needs to flow like a river of ice. And that river of ice needs to have zones of accumulation and zones of ablation. The snow and ice must accumulate at the top, and it must have ablation at the bottom, where it melts and calves. In the scientific discourse of glaciology, glaciers must also have tongues and toes and glacial milk. Glaciers are also terraformers. From the last ice age up until the present, they both erode and move the ground beneath them. They have literally shaped the earth as they have moved across it. But I also believe that glaciers are wonderful, existential, and philosophical objects that allow for existential reflection for all of us. I think it's also fair to ask why we should care about glaciers. After all, and arguably, they are not living things. So why should we care about melting glaciers? For one, they are very clear indicators of climate change, of a melting world. And when they melt, we also get sea level rise. They are also a critical water and food supply for 2 billion people around the world. Glaciers also provide albedo, which reflects light and heat. And it also reduces the absorption of heat and thus reduces global warming for us all. Glaciers also provide ecosystems, and they create worlds for creatures that are called extremophiles. Glaciers exist on nearly every continent on Earth. And in many places, glaciers provide a space of sentience and a shared kinship for the people who live near them and with them. For me, glaciers are also a place where we can have a meditation on both intimacy and immensity. Because in glaciers, we go from this diminutive drop of water, this tiny bit of liquid form, to the entirety of the world's hydrosphere. That is all of the world's water upon which all of life depends. Because without the hydrosphere, without water, there is nothing alive on Earth anywhere. Glaciers are a key part of that hydrosphere, and they are, of course, being radically transformed very quickly by human behavior. So now let me take you back about a decade when I began a research project in Iceland that I called MELT, the Social Life of Ice. As Emily mentioned, I am an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist. So when I think about the dramatic changes in the environment, I also think about how human practices and values are impregnated in that change. So I went to Iceland to find out about how Icelanders are contending with the loss of ice all around them. And Iceland is a good place to do this, not just because the country is called Iceland, but because Iceland is also very closely linked to the cryosphere, that is the world of ice. About 10% of the island is covered in ice, and if you were to take all of the ice in Iceland and spread it evenly across the surface of the country, it would cover the entire island country in about 2 meters of ice. Now, Iceland is losing about 11 billion tons of ice every year to cryospheric melt. To find out about how Icelanders were working through the loss of ice all around them, I found myself speaking with many glaciologists, people like Guðfinna Alþergisdóttir. And you see Guðfinna here in the front. That's her holding the pencil. She's here with students measuring the mass balance of a glacier, which she does every summer when she takes students to the top of Sólheimajökull Glacier. When I spoke with Guðfinna, which I did very often, and as I have over many years that we've spent together, she was very frank. She said, with climate change, we are undertaking the largest uncontrolled experiment in the history of the world. And it was with some irony that she added, we will see where it leads us. And when I spoke with Hulda Jónsdóttir, who grew up in the Westfjord region of Iceland, she recalled the sound of sea ice in the harbor when she was a child. Now she hears those sounds no more. And she told me that she did miss those sounds of sea ice in the harbor as a child. In one of our many discussions, the author, filmmaker, and environmental activist André Snæra Magnusson put it this way. He said, "Glaciers were forever. When my grandmother traveled across the glaciers, it was in the context of eternity. It was like the waves, the rocks, the sand, things that would change only over thousands of years. But now, many of these same glaciers will vanish in the time between when someone is born today and when they become my grandmother's age." In seeking out bodies of ice and the people who are connected to them, I came across a little glacier called Okjökull, or Ok Glacier, being that the Icelandic word for glacier is jökull. Here is Ok on a hand-painted map from the year 1844. Ok Mountain, a former shield volcano, is outlined in blue. You see it here on the map. And the glacier itself, Ok Glacier, sits just beside the mountain's peak. Now here is a picture of Ok Glacier in 1978. And you can see the ice mass on the top. This is the glacier. And you can see what are called fern lines. They cascade out like these tree rings, kind of like a cut tree. These tree rings, these fern lines, is where the snow has accumulated, the snow and ice has accumulated. And right below is the crater of the mountain, and the snow has accumulated on top of the crater of the mountain. And it's taken on this very surreal, almost smiling face. And it's sort of, I think, weirdly winking at us or smiling at us from the past and into the future, perhaps into the present, and sort of smiling at us through snow and ice and stone, maybe sending us a message from the past into the future. Now here is a picture I took from the top of Ok Mountain, looking into the crater in 2018. And here you can see in the center that a little lake has formed. If you can see that little tiny bit of blue water and ice in the middle of the photograph there, that's a little tiny lake that's formed at the top of Ok Mountain. When we spoke with an Icelandic linguist who specializes in place names, he taught us that Ok Mountain, can actually write its own name. In ancient Icelandic, Ok would have been spelled with the letters OC, which you can actually see here on top of the mountain. The outside of the crater makes an O, and then the rocks inside the crater make a C, and so you have an O and a C. So as the linguist told us, a mountain that writes its own name is pretty special. So in ancient Icelandic, it would have been spelled OC. Now, of course, today, Ok Mountain is spelled OK. There are many reasons to become enchanted with this little glacier with the funny name. But I was also very certain that Ok could not be OK, since as a glacier living in the world today, it was sure to be melting away. I soon learned that for certain when I came across a very short report, and I do mean very short. The whole thing was just over 70 words total. What I found in that report was that, in fact, Okjökull was no longer a glacier. It had been officially declassified as a glacier. Occiocult was now only what glaciologists call dead ice. Occiocult was also the first casualty. It was the first major glacier to be lost to climate change in Iceland. And I want to underscore a point here too, that while it was widely known around the world at that time and now that glaciers were retreating, that is, melting and becoming smaller, there was no awareness or conversation about dead glaciers. That is, that those had stopped being a glacier altogether. So here we had gone from a time of retreat or melting and becoming smaller, from a time of retreat to a time of extinction. So here is Occiocult in the summer of 1986, where you can see the snow and the ice, and you can see the glacier still existed in 1986 here, just above the crater, and then in the summer of 2019, where you can see that really the glacier is gone altogether, and there's nothing left except some remnants of snow. So the fact that Occiocult had been felled by climate change was significant to Oddur Sigurdsson, the glaciologist who discovered Okkiokolt's demise. And when I spoke to Oddur, he put it this way. He said, "It is a loss. It is like losing an old friend." However, Oddur's feeling that he had lost an old friend, however, was really the exception, because while Ok was an important named glacier, literally on every map of Iceland, very few Icelanders had paid much attention to its passing, and the world at large seemed to know nothing about it. There really was a kind of collective shrug about the loss of Occiocult. And it was this sentiment that inspired me and my research partner to work with an Icelandic cinematographer to create a short film. We saw this as a way to tell Ok's story in a more creative and accessible and public-facing way. And here we have the movie poster. This is from opening night in Reykjavik. The film is called Not Okay, or Not Ok, a little movie about a small glacier at the end of the world. This film is really an experimental documentary or an ethnographic film, and in many ways, it tells the biography of this little mountain and its little glacier. And it was really through making the film that we were inspired to give Ok more closure and to recognize its passing in a more fulsome way. Now here I think it's relevant to point out, too, the importance of ritual. Now, for cultural anthropology, this is, of course, a long-standing subject of study. We know that everywhere on Earth and throughout human history, even prehistory, that people have performed ceremonies for the dead. These ceremonies are all different in their acts and their words, but funerary rituals are a universal aspect of being human, everywhere and throughout time. On August 18th, 2019, we took up this call and we hiked to the top of Ok Mountain. We were about 6 scientists and activists and artists and a handful of political figures. The oldest among us was in his 70s and the youngest was about 9 years old. It took us about 2 hours to make it to Ok, where Ok Glacier used to reside, to the top of Ok Mountain. And there we held a memorial for Ok Glacier, one with a very clear environmental message. This was the first memorial for a glacier anywhere in the world, and it was a funeral of a kind. There we installed a plaque, and the words on that plaque were very important for the ceremony and for the message that we were trying to convey. This was framed as a letter to the future. And the words were written in Icelandic at the top and then in English at the bottom. And the words said this, a letter to the future. Ok is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. So I want to underscore that on top of the mountain that day, the spirit and the feeling was less about grief than it was about conviction. We were not paralyzed with fear or hopelessness, but in fact empowered by being together and by doing something, even if it was not everything. And because this was the first memorial for a glacier anywhere in the world, it became a news event. And to our great surprise, it became a news story in many places all over the world. We saw headlines in many languages, and stories appeared in places like The Guardian and the BBC, Washington Post and New York Times, Der Spiegel and Le Monde. It appeared on television and on radio. And The Economist magazine published its first ever obituary for a non-human, for the Occidental Glacier. Following the Economist obituary, someone sent us this tweet, which came rather randomly, but is kind of an interesting example, I think. It says, "As a longtime reader of The Economist, I have often been moved by the obituary column, but I was astonished to find myself weeping over the death of the Occidental Glacier in Iceland, a response triggered as much by the beauty of the writing as the poignancy of the event. Later that day, I called my broker and divested all of my fossil fuel holdings." Now, this is just one example of a clearly moneyed person divesting their funds, but pulling capital away from fossil fuels is also, of course, an important step in slowing the climate crisis. It is a small effort in the right direction, or as it says on the Occidental plaque, it is a matter of knowing what is happening and what needs to be done. Since then, there have been these memorial afterlives where the plaque has been reproduced and been placed in installations in Switzerland and Iceland, and will soon be in a European Commission installation in the Million Generations Project, a Good Ancestors installation in Paris at the UNESCO World Futures Day. The plaque was nominated as a finalist in the 2020 Beazley Design Award at the London Design Museum. It was competing with one of Banksy's pieces, but it actually lost out to a 3D design of the coronavirus. I think in 2020, the only thing on anyone's mind was the coronavirus. It also showed up at Mayor Garcetti's inaugural address at the C40 meetings. C40 is a group of climate-forward cities who are trying to enact better climate legislation, and he mentioned Occidental in his inaugural address as an example of the way we need to have enhanced climate action and governance and different models of how to convey that to different groups of people and populations. But immediately after the Occidental initiative and memorial ceremony, Pizzol Glacier was memorialized in Switzerland just 1 month later, which led to an important initiative in Switzerland, as you'll see in the installation over here, the Glacier Initiative, and a group memorialized Pizzol Glacier and led to some important political changes. Between 2019 and 2023, Switzerland held 3 more glacier funerals. During that same period, France, Mexico, Spain, and the United States held their first glacier funerals. And very recently, just a few months ago in Nepal, they held a ceremony, a funeral for Yala Glacier. Since 2020, we know from the science that glaciers in every region are now in steady decline. Total glacier ice loss annually now is about 273 billion tons of ice per year and growing. The prognostications are not good. According to the most recent modeling, if the world continues on its present course, and we're on course for 2.7 degrees Celsius warming over our pre-industrial levels, the world will eventually lose almost 3/4 of its glacial mass. If we are able to hold at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we will lose not quite half, but close of our glacial mass. What that means is that every 0.1 degrees Celsius of difference that we are able to maintain will make a difference. So clearly, one of the challenges of our present times is how to make the global cryospheric crisis, or the loss of ice, more meaningful to people, more important in people's lives, especially to people who may not have a direct personal connection to a glacier, who may not feel those changes, those shifts in very profound ways, in a regular way, as part of their daily or quotidian lives. The United Nations has declared the year 2025 as the International Year of Glaciers Preservation. And it's interesting because the UN had a pretty major rollout of this in January of this year, and yet I won't ask for a show of hands, but I wonder how many people in this room even know about this initiative. I don't think the UN did a great job of creating a lot of awareness around this, and yet this was a major initiative. So we have the International Year of Glaciers Preservation, which is meant to bring awareness, and yet I think some of our international bodies are not doing everything they can to bring the awareness. Still, the intention is to make the decade of glaciers preservation, so hopefully more awareness will come through that. I do think that we need to continue to have more collaborative projects that don't just come through governmental bodies like the United Nations, but work with artists and scientists and other civil society in order to raise awareness and make these changes in behavior. So in honor of the 5th anniversary of the October Memorial, and also coinciding with the UN's International Year, I've also been working with collaborators to create the Global Glacier Casualty List, which we launched in August of 2024 in order to coincide with the UN Year of Glaciers Preservation. So the Global Glacier Casualty List is a platform which is meant to communicate the disappearance of glaciers and how that is affecting us as human beings. The website is very interactive, and it represents every continent on Earth that has glaciers. And through the website, you can scroll through and find different stories about disappearing glaciers, those that are about to disappear, those that have disappeared, and you can find different countries. It's geotagged so that you can zoom into the sites of former glaciers and see the terrain that surrounds them. And you can actually zoom in and sort of toggle back and forth and see these terrains very clearly. This interactive technology of the site is helpful, but the real impulse behind the casualty list is to be a place of cultural remembrance. That is, to blend scientific information with storytelling as told by those who really know these glaciers so well. So, for example, the Pico Humboldt Glacier in Venezuela was lost in 2024. Venezuela once had 5 mountain glaciers. Now they are a country that has exactly 0 glaciers. And there's a wonderful story told by indigenous people about how the glaciers arrived as 5 white eagles that flew across the sky. And this indigenous princess was chasing the eagles, and then they flew to the highest mountain peaks. They landed on the mountain peaks, folded their wings, and became the glaciers atop these mountains. And now the glaciers are gone, the eagles are gone, the only way they remain is in story. And so on this website, we have the story recorded, and this is a way to preserve those stories, even though the glaciers themselves are gone. One of the glaciers that appears on the casualty list is Oscillating Glacier, which is located in a small valley near Glaciers Fjord, the most northern permanent settlement in Canada. And here you can see it kind of in the middle of the slide here. The name Oscillating means the place that never thaws, and yet the glacier here is steadily wasting away faster than many others in the high Arctic landscape. Changes to Oscillating have, of course, impacted the local Inuit community, and by the middle of this century, the little glacier of Glaciers Fjord is predicted to be gone. So, let me tell you a final story. And this is a story of the glacier graveyard. This is a collaborative installation in Iceland that we created in the middle of August of last year in Seltjarnarnes, Iceland, which is just outside the capital city of Reykjavik. Here is Osvik Tuk's headstone being placed in the graveyard. And this is Otto Magnusson. This is the Icelandic ice carver who made all of the tombstones for the graveyard. There's only one ice carver in all of Iceland. He's a master ice carver, and he created all of them and installed them all himself. The glacier graveyard was comprised of 15 headstones. They were all made from ice, all of which were on the original casualty list, representing glaciers from all over the world. We had an Icelandic funeral choir singing traditional funerary songs. They sang all of those songs in Icelandic. And we had people from all over the world to read eulogies for each of those glaciers. We were there on that day to honor the passing of these many glaciers from all over the world. Now, most people on Earth will never touch a glacier. They will never smell a glacier. They will never taste a glacier. Most of us will never wander across one or know what they feel like. For a long time now, we have been hearing about how glaciers are becoming smaller, about how they are shrinking and becoming weaker and becoming thinner. But now we're in a time when they're not just fading away, they are leaving us altogether. So these are glaciers with names and with stories. These are glaciers that are important to the people who live near them and who work with them. Some people say that glaciers cannot really die because they were never alive. And yet they crawl over the land and they reach their toes into valleys. They lay their tongues across mountain peaks. Their glacial milk falls into rivers and gives water to people for drink and for food and for livestock. Some people say that glaciers are time machines, that they gather into them the dust and the pollen and the pebbles and the air. They hold on to everything that touches them. Some people say that glaciers are alive, that they have spirit and consciousness, that they are like family, and that they are kin. Everyone standing there on that day knew that glaciers are special, that we are lucky to have had glaciers because they help us. Glaciers help us to remember that we are small because they are so huge. They help us to remember that life is short because they live so long. Glaciers are made of water, and we are made of water. We share the same body, and in this way, glaciers show us what we are made of. Everyone standing there that day, and everyone gathered here today, knows that everywhere in the world, people have different ways to commemorate the dead. Sometimes the color of mourning is black, and sometimes it is white. In Nepal, where Yala Glacier sits, bodies of the dead are placed on a funeral pyre. The fire is lit by the eldest son. When the body has turned completely to ash, it is gathered up and scattered. If possible, that ash is placed into the waters of a river, often a sacred glacial river like the Ganges. In Tibet, near where Tadagu Glacier lies, the dead are given a sky burial. Monks chant sutras, and the body is placed atop a sacred mountain. There, that body is able to enact one final gesture of charity, of benevolence, by nourishing the birds that circle overhead. In Colombia, where Santa Isabel Glacier once lived, the dead are grieved with prayers and recitations of the rosary. The body is burned, or it is buried. For 9 days, masses are held to help the soul of the deceased find their way to heaven. In all the thousands of ways that people can mourn the dead, we also know that with death everywhere, the funerals and the rituals that we create are not really for the dead as much as they are for the living. We had never had a glacier graveyard before because we had never needed one, but now we do. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust, ice into water and into the earth, into the sea and into the air. This is where the dead glaciers now reside. But this was not only a funeral for the world's glaciers, it was also a celebration of their life. It was an invitation to hold their ice in our hands, because we do hold their lives in our hands. All of us gathered here today will one day die. Every person that we know or have ever known will also die. And that is what it means to be human, and that is what it means to be living. But the glaciers of the world do not need to die. They can continue to live and to thrive if we collectively can choose a better way. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation on this sort of glacier loss and, hopefully not extinction, but what seems to be veering towards extinction.
Yeah.
When you document glaciers, do you document the animal life and the reaction of animal life to the glaciers, as well as like the human life around the glacier?
Yeah, some of what we have in the Global Glacier Casualty List, the website, some of those stories do have to do with animals. Anderson Glacier, for example, which is in Washington State in the United States, there's a wonderful story there about salmon and how the rivers that are created by the glacier affect salmon life. It's a breeding ground for salmon, and as the glacier has dissipated and died, the salmon that live in that space are now being affected by that. And there's also another story about Hofsjökull, which is a glacier in Iceland where reindeer gather. And so as Hofsjökull is disappearing, those reindeer now don't have a place to gather because it was a place of safety for them. So definitely wildlife of different kinds are an important part of the storytelling that is in the casualty list. I mean, I'm not a wildlife biologist, I'm a cultural anthropologist, so it comes, I'd say that, animals and creatures and wildlife and different sorts of biological ecologies come into the stories in different ways. And so I document them as they come in through narratives and different forms in that way, but they're certainly part of the stories that people tell, either in metaphorical terms or in actual ecological terms. And one of the things that I've learned from working with glaciologists are about these creatures called extremophiles, which you may know about. Those are often microscopic forms of life that live in extreme environments like glaciers. They can also live in volcanic environments. And they can usually only live in those very extreme environments. And scientists are very interested in them, in part because they have adapted to these very rarefied ecosystems. They're also interested in them because they may be forms of life that may be living in extraplanetary spaces. And so the world of extremophiles is also another kind of interesting ecosystemic question around glaciers. And when we lose glaciers, we're also losing ecosystems that are important for science, but obviously also important for the creatures that live with and around them.
Yeah, thanks for the really very moving talk at the end, Cymene. I didn't know about this graveyard project, but I wonder, actually, that's where my question starts a little bit, is if you could talk more about maybe the kind of funerary cultures in Iceland specifically. Like, I know people who live in northern places, there's a kind of emphasis on adaptability to the environment, this kind of inevitability of constant change within their environments. And so I'm wondering, one element there, like just kind of culturally in Iceland, how that figures. and then specifically, how they think of death in that island context, and then in this case going to this kind of ambiguous non-human death, or is it in these very like anthropocentric modes of remembrance? I'm wondering if you could just kind of put those two things together more.
Right. Yeah. I mean, historically, when the first Icelanders, when the first people inhabited the island, which was about 1,200 years ago, it's interesting because that was the first time of settlement, but there was no colonization in the sense that there was no displacement of other people. The first round of people to come to the island were the first human beings that we know of to live on the island. And there's a lot of volcanic activity in Iceland, as probably everyone knows. So one of the issues when they first got there was that it was very difficult to bury the dead because there was so much magma and volcanic activity that they were very worried about burying the dead because of the kind of geologic activity and concerns about not just eruptions, but that there would be damage to the bodies when they placed bodies underground. And so there were some above ground burials in the beginning until people figured out sort of where they could place the bodies of the dead. And so there's been this kind of constant negotiation about how to bury people in Iceland for some time until that got worked out. And the country has never had a lot of soil to begin with. It's a very rocky place with a lot of lava rock and magma. So there are a lot of interesting sort of funerary practices around that, but there is a long tradition of a funerary song, which is part of the reason we wanted to have the funeral choir and to make that an important part of that, and the singing is an important part of these practices. And I mean, generally they're, pulling from these Protestant traditions of Christianity. That's the predominant religious practice in the country. So that's the kind of general practice. I'd say those are the kind of key components to the funeral practices in Iceland in general. But in this, we wanted to, on the one hand, we wanted to have a graveyard that was recognizable to Icelanders because that's where we placed the graveyard before it melted away, and it melted away very quickly. I mean, it melted probably within about 24 hours, it was gone. But we also wanted to make sure that we had a very international group of people reading the eulogies, and all of those headstones were representing glaciers from all over the world. So that was really trying to get that kind of representation too. We did not fly in people from all over the world. Luckily, there were a lot of students at the University of Iceland there, still there during the summer, so we found a student who was from Kenya who was able to come out and read the eulogy for Kilimanjaro, and there was a student from China who was able to read the eulogy for Dagu, and so there was a woman who was from Colombia, and so we were able to find students who were able to read the eulogies. So that was convenient because we really didn't have the resources to, but we also, for climate reasons, also did not want to fly in people from all over the world. So, whenever you're doing these sorts of projects, I think especially if you're doing work on climate change, you want to have a real awareness about the kind of impact your project is having on the environment as well.
Thank you for the talk. It was a beautiful presentation. I studied environment and I kind of disconnected from it for a very long time because it felt very depressing.
Yes.
So I really appreciate how you're telling stories in a way that doesn't just feel sad. And I was just curious to know what made you interested in this subject, how you got started working on glaciers.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for saying that about how it can be very depressing. It can be very depressing. And, oftentimes when I'm talking about this work, I do kind of crack. And I made it through this presentation pretty well, but earlier today, when I was practicing this presentation, I didn't. Like, I actually had to go and get tissue. Like, I'm glad that I made it through today without crying, because sometimes I cry when I just talk about this stuff. Yeah, it's hard. Like, I think it's really hard to work on these topics, because when you read the news, when you keep up with this material, it puts you into it's a really difficult frame of mind to be in, because there's not a lot of hopeful news out there. The science keeps telling us more and more grim facts. And then when we look at the politics, if I look at the politics in the country where I live, it's getting worse and worse, and I keep hoping it's going to get better. And then I look at the global politics, and they're not much better. So I was having hope for a while, and now I'm feeling worse again. But you were asking a better question, which is like, where is the hope? I think the hope is in the younger generation, because I also do teach undergraduate students and graduate students, and they're very attuned to the future, and they are very resolute about making changes. And so I know that sounds a little, I don't know, maybe hokey or saccharine, but I do feel like younger people are very much committed to making changes, and they're not acquiescing to any kind of, laissez-faire attitude about the present conditions. And so I think if we work together with younger people who understand that we can't keep on the same course that we're on, then hopefully we can make the changes that we need to. I'm not exactly sure how that comes about. How did I get interested in this in the first place? As I said, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I found out about these dynamics in Iceland, and I got fascinated with them. I'm not from a place that has ice, like I'm not from a place that has glaciers, so I don't come to it from a kind of growing up in that world. But I found out about this situation in Iceland, and I became fascinated with it, and then it really came about through stumbling across this glacier called Ok, and the kind of weird story around it. And then I guess sort of almost like a journalist, I kind of followed the story, and it was like fascinating and weird and like kind of sad and strange, and no one was paying attention to it. And so I just sort of chased it for a while, and then it opened up all these other stories, and then it led to these other things. And so I think it was sort of serendipity in a weird way. And I've always been interested in environments and water, and so it kind of just gelled all together in that way. It's a weird story how we come to things. And sometimes I never expected it. Like I never thought in my career as an anthropologist that I'd be talking about ice. I really didn't. I started out doing work in Latin America about queer social movements. And so this is a path that I never expected, but I wound up here, and it's been a really fascinating trip.
Thank you very much for your talk. I appreciated being able to hear some of the strategies that you've come to for creative projects that are thinking about memorializing this kind of loss. And also that in a previous answer, you acknowledged the kind of tensions of doing this kind of work and the cost that it can take environmentally to realize those kinds of projects, and being mindful about flying folks around the world to do this kind of work. I'm coming to this conversation as a curator who works with contemporary artists, and I couldn't help but a few times during this conversation thinking about folks like Ólafur Eliasson. I'm not sure if you or others in the room are familiar with, but I often find myself thinking about these two instances in the 2010s when he brought these kind of small growlers that had calved off of icebergs off the coast of Greenland, to public squares in London and Paris, which certainly was like this spectacular moment of like public discourse around climate change, but that he's also publicly reflected that in hindsight, the kind of carbon cost of doing that work, does it really justify the impact or the efficacy of creating that work?
Right.
All of this to say, I wonder if you wanted to comment on projects like that, or how you find your way through that tension, or if there are other folks who you think are developing good strategies for kind of staying with the trouble of that.
Yeah, Olafur's, the Ice Watch was I think what he called those projects, and the one in Paris during the COP conferences, I think was one of, I mean, the one in London was really big, but the one in Paris was one that got a lot of attention. And he worked with a geologist, Minik Rossig, who was, and they took parts of the Greenlandic ice sheet, or was it sea ice? I can't remember, but they did take some pieces of Greenlandic ice and then hauled it all the way over to Paris and put it on the streets of Paris to melt away. And yeah, he has reflected on that and the climate cost. I think it was a very spectacular installation, and I think moving for a lot of people. I didn't see it in person. I've read about it and kind of reflected on it. It's a great question. I don't know if I have a great answer to your question. I mean, the kind of work that Olafur Eliasson does is super grand in scale. Like, he does these super huge installations. I know he's working on a piece right now with Robert McFarlane, which is kind of like terraforming this beach somewhere in England, and sort of, rescaling the land there. It's like these really, really huge pieces of work. And on the one hand, it's very spectacular and it really makes a huge statement. But on the other hand, it's very impactful on the environment. And you can say that it really shows people something very dramatic, and it gets a lot of attention. And someone like Olafur Eliasson has the resources and the clout and the capability to do something like that, but it also makes a big scar on the environment, right? And I think Ice Watch did that as well through its emissions. So is the message worth the impact? I'm not sure. We do things at a smaller scale. I mean, this little glacier graveyard had some kind of environmental impact, like everything does. It didn't get as much attention. It kind of melts into the grass and feeds the grass, but then maybe doesn't get as much messaging across as something like Eliasson's work does. So I think your question is a really good one, like, how do we stay with the trouble, put out a message of some kind, do something that we feel creatively committed to, that has an aesthetics that is compelling and powerful, that doesn't create more environmental destruction than it does good for the kind of purposeful creativity that we want to put out into the world. So that's like a really big creative question for all of us, I think. And the research that goes into that, the creative powers that go into that, are something that I think each of us has to ask of ourselves. And I hope that someone like Eliasson is asking that of himself. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question. It's a hard one to answer. It's like, his scale is dramatic, but I think we do have to ask the question, is like, is it worth it to make that kind of impact for the sorts of effects that it's creating? And I think every creative act has to sort of weigh out those creative possibilities against the impacts that they have.
Thank you.